Let me show you a place where you gon' wanna move your feet until they start to.
We're going to welcome everybody to Compensation Conversations. We're going to get you through those muddy waters with our commission conundrum we're in. So welcome to our second video in the series that we're doing today. So
yeah, we're glad to see everybody coming back for round 2 of our videos. And we're going to actually get into some of the meat of the conversations. Today, we're going to cover conversations that you should be having with your sellers, and along with some points that you can kind of take and repurpose into your own words and use that when you're meeting with clients and explaining what this all means to them.
And just like we mentioned on the last video, we had put up some resources on the compensation section of the extranet. There's actually another document that we're going to post up there today regarding some talking points with sellers. So Nadine, let's start with when you go and meet with a seller or when you're talking to agents about meeting with sellers. What is your practice with talking to a seller about this compensation lawsuit situation?
Well, so the first thing I like to do is, even before I meet with my seller, is just kind of prepare myself with, a quick little outline of the quick hits that I want to hit about this conversation, because I think you can get too in the weeds with it and kind of too in your head, and then the seller's eyes just kind of glaze over and they really don't understand what you're talking about, and they just want to move on with the compensation conversation, but they don't feel confident that they understand what you're talking about. So that's the first thing that I do. And in those points, I kind of do a how did we get here? And then why is it important to, be flexible with your offers of compensation? Everybody's situation is different. However, I feel, and I know that you feel, a lot of people feel, that making an offer of compensation, and I like to call it an allowance of compensation to the buyer side, is the best practice to get the largest buyer pool.
Right, get the best offers, highest price, best terms. So more buyers we have, the better we're going to make out with that. I think that I've had several agents ask me, should I mention the lawsuit situation? Do I bring it up? And our recommendation, and I think we both agree on this, is yes, we do think you should bring it up. You should get some level of comprehension as to what your seller knows or doesn't know about the current situation out there. And as Nadine said, we don't need to get in the weeds. We're just going to cover that at a high level. Just here's what's going on. Mention that it's a class action lawsuit, or that there are several class action lawsuits out there. So you can mention it. You should mention it, because I think the last thing that any of us want to do is not have that conversation and sign the listing agreement and discuss buyer agency compensation and put it out there. And then the seller comes back to you 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later when they see something in the news and say, why didn't you mention that? So we don't want to and we don't think anybody wants to be in that situation. So our recommendation is that you mention it on a high level.
I agree. The last thing you want to do is, be 3 weeks into a listing contract and have them ask you, and then, it's usually on a phone call while you're trying to eat dinner or something, and then you have to quick on your feet, think of responses to their questions. So if you can go in and control the conversation, it's going to be a much better outcome than if the seller is controlling and initiating the conversation.
Being proactive. Yeah. Be proactive. Some of the things that Nadine mentioned, the talking points as far as getting as many buyers to the table as possible, I think it's important that sellers understand that most buyers are not able to come up with the down payment, the closing costs, and on top of that, a commission. And that's why it's important that we look at how do we get all the buyers to the table, get the highest offers, best price and terms, and that would be by offering buyer agent compensation. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning when you're speaking with a seller is that the comparables that you're using for your pricing all generally include 2 sides of commission in them. So if we're going to now adjust how much we're going to offer out or not offer out, which so far, knock on wood, I don't think anybody's really run into that here. But if we're going to offer less out, then we need to take a look at the comps and whether or not our pricing needs to be adjusted, because there's no longer that factored in. One of the things I love that Anita Hill did and said on one of our last CEUs is she showed a little slide, which I'll also post up on the website on the compensation section. She showed a little slide that the money is not coming from the buyer or the seller. I mean, the seller pays it at closing, but the buyer comes to the table with all of that money in order to buy the home. And so technically, the compensation for both sides comes from the transaction, and technically they're both paying it. So there's a great little slide that shows it coming from the transaction, which I'll also post up in case you want to use it in your listing presentation.
We've always been champions of transparency, and now the rest of the industry is also coming around to realizing that it's really the best course of action, and making sure that our clients are well informed and aware of what's going on in the market, but also what's going on in the real estate industry and how that impacts them. So the first talking point that I would address with a seller is that you want to have the largest possible buyer pool. And at all price ranges, there are going to be buyers, and they may be very well qualified buyers that want representation for one reason or other. And they may not choose to offer on a property that is not going to allow some offers.
So when you look at VA and some of the other loan programs out there, they do not allow legally for the buyer to pay anything beyond their costs for the loan. So they're not going to be able to pay a buyer's agent. It's against their loan program. So for a veteran who's out there looking, he's just going to be out of luck and can't look at that home that doesn't offer compensation.
Another point to address with a seller is that if you don't put out an offer of compensation for a buyer's agent, then you're at the whim for an offer to include compensation at whatever rate they have negotiated with their client. Whereas if you put out an offer of compensation, you're kind of putting it out there that, yes, we will go up to this amount, and it just gives you a much more powerful leg to negotiate that offer and compensation that comes in from the buyer and their agent. So you may be offering 2%, but the buyer's agent wrote in 3% in the offer. And it's a lot easier to negotiate down than if you have nothing there and then the seller's just left thinking that they have to accept what comes in that offer.
True. It gives you, it's kind of like a home inspection issue.
Yeah.
You're negotiating from a point of weakness as opposed to having these things addressed and negotiating based on what you know and what you'd like to do. So this gives the seller the leg up in negotiating because this is what they've offered. And I think we should talk about unrepresented buyers, but I think that's going to have to be in one of our next series because
you got 15 minutes.
we have a lot to say about what's going to happen if buyers come to you unrepresented. So we have lots of information about that and lots of recommendations when it comes to that. But in the meantime, make sure that you have that conversation with the seller. Make sure that you check out our resources on the extranet under the compensation section, and make sure that we make that house. Our job is to get the job done and well. And so we want that house to look well. We want everybody who wants to buy a home in that price range in town to be out there wanting to see it. You want to present it well, which includes having a compensation offer to the buyer's agent. Join us next week for series number 3 in our series, and we'll be talking about how did we get here? How did these compensation conversations come up? How did these lawsuits come about? How did we get here with agency? So join us next week when we talk about how did we get here.
Just remember, we're always here for you.
Let me show you a place.